Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's seminar in the history of collecting. Before we start, I'd just like to give some housekeeping rules. First, this seminar will be recorded, and we will put the recording in the Wallace Collections YouTube channel. So if you have to leave at any point, you will be able to find the full seminar there. And secondly, if you have any questions or technical issues, please write them in the chat. We will read the questions out at the end of the seminar, and I will try to help with any technical issues. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wallace Collections October seminar in the history of collecting. My name's Suzanne Higgett, and I'm one of the curators at the Wallace Collection. I'm delighted to welcome you, and also it gives me great pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker, Dr. Mark Hall. Mark hails from Scotland, where he has held various posts at Perth Museum Art Gallery since 1995. He is currently the museum's collections officer for the Cultural Trust, Culture, Perth and Kinross. His main area of responsibility is the archaeological collection, but he also looks after the ethnography, numismatics and arms and armour collections at the museum. He is co-chair of the medieval panel for the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, has held research fellowships at several universities, and is an active member of a number of archaeological and antiquarian societies and organisations. Academically, Mark has specialised in archaeology and museum studies. He completed his doctoral thesis on medieval material culture, explorations of play, performance, and biographical trajectories at the University of Sheffield in 2018. Mark's extensive bibliography includes a number of publications concerning board games, gaming, childhood and play, particularly in the medieval period. During and after Mark's talk, as Natalia just requested, please send in any questions that you have for Mark through chat. I'm delighted now to invite you, Mark, to present your lecture, The Perth Literary and Antiquarian Society, 1784 to 1914, Collecting Scotland, Collecting the World. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Wallace Collection for accepting my contribution to their seminar programme, and to Natalia and Suzanne for steering me skillfully to this point of delivery. I've switched off my camera to save on bandwidth. My subject is the Antiquarian Society of Perth, which soon became the Literary and Antiquarian Society of Perth, and in the late 19th century, the Scientific Literary and Antiquarian Society of Perth. The presentation is in 5 parts: the background context, a brief history of the society, collecting Scotland, collecting Southwest Asia and the Pacific, and a conclusion and a brief look at the future. So turning to part 1, to repeat a little what Suzanne said, I work at Perth Museum and Art Gallery, Perth in Scotland, where I'm principally responsible for the archaeology collection and for helping to deliver the projected new museum for Perth. Our research for the new museum includes re-evaluating our long history of collecting across 4 centuries. The museum's first iteration, the Literary and Antiquarian Society, built the first museum, the Rotunda, paid for by public subscription, and including a monument to the former provost, historian, military commander, and society member, Thomas Hay Marshall. It remains part of the current museum, as you can see here. The society ceased operation and transferred its museum and collections to the Perth Town Council in 1914. It has remained a local authority responsibility ever since, including an extension in the mid-1930s, paid for by a bequest from Robert Brough. Local government has changed several times, and currently the museum is the responsibility of Perth and Kinross Council, which for the last 5 years has been through the mechanism of a cultural trust, Culture, Perth and Kinross. Planning for the new museum began in 2017, and the current opening is scheduled for 2024. The detail of this is a separate talk, but this slide gives a flavour with the project rooted around the conversion of the former City Hall in the centre of town. Within the re-evaluation being undertaken, a key issue is the colonial legacy of the primarily 19th century collecting under the auspices of the Society. Okay, part 2. Lord Buchan is dead, a person whose immense vanity, bordering on insanity, obscured, or rather eclipsed, very considerable talents. This pointed tribute was written in 1828 by Sir Walter Scott after attending the funeral of David Stuart Erskine, 11th Earl of Buchan. Buchan was a passionate promoter of the study of Scottish history and archaeology, mostly remembered for founding the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1780. His somewhat overbearing and eccentric character probably contributed to his unhappy departure from that society in 1790. Seeking a high-profile and well-connected figurehead for their new venture, the Perth Society persuaded Erskine to become their first president in 1785. In recognition, the ever-humble Erskine gifted this portrait to the Society, solemnly noting that the frame was made of the oak which sheltered the great Sir William Wallace in the Torwood. Erskine's reference to and reverence for the oak seems entirely appropriate to the antiquarian aspirations of the Society, but it is an element that is also cautionary. The Torwood or Wallace oak was legendarily associated with William Wallace in the 13th century, its hollow trunk supposedly serving as his headquarters, hiding place, and sleeping quarters. By the 17th century, the tree was being used to make Wallace souvenirs, which led to its decay and loss. By 1830, it was described as badly affected by the removal of timber and reduced to a single stump. Souvenir hunters resorted to digging up its roots, and by 1835, it was dead and gone. Buchan had clearly ensured his supply of the wood, as before the frame for his portrait, he used some of the wood to make a snuff box in 1782, which he presented to US President George Washington in 1791 to demonstrate that American democratic practices had their roots in Wallace's actions. Let's return to the foundation of the Society. Its key founder was the Reverend James Scott. This portrait was commissioned by the Society in 1790. In his hand, Scott holds a copy of the preliminary discourse that he authored and read at the foundation meeting of the Society on the 16th of December, 1784, when he met with 7 other men, including another 3 ministers, in a room of the old Perth Academy building. This overlooks the college yards, a site opposite the medieval parish church of St. John's, where Scott was minister. The yards and their surrounding buildings and markets were demolished to make way for the City Hall in 1844, demolished and rebuilt in 1909. It is that later building which will become the new Perth Museum. Scott's preliminary discourse was given more concrete form nearly 2 years later with its publication for members as a series of subjects for illustration, a sort of proto-archaeological agenda, a coherent list of questions of research for the members to address. Roman and Caledonian relations seemed pertinent given the weight of Roman earthwork remains in Perthshire, sparking such questions as the state of this country at the time of the Roman invasions and the history of the Roman invasions, conquests and retreat. Consequently, the Society appointed in 1789 a subcommittee to map Perthshire's Roman roads and encampments, and also acquired a 7-volume copy of Tacitus, regarded as the definitive text on the ancient state of northern Britain. It remains a pertinent subject for the Scottish research agenda. A new exhibition exploring the presence of Rome in Perthshire has just opened at Perth Museum, and these questions and many others inform the ongoing Scottish archaeological research framework managed by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The historically orientated antiquarian agenda of the Society was further confirmed by the range of questions to be asked of post-Roman Scotland, including the establishment of universities, their revenues and influences on the manners of the nation, the foundation and rise of the principal towns of Scotland, the food, beverage and stated times for meals at different periods, the history of poetry, music and language in this country, and alterations in dress. As it grew, the Society remained entirely male in its membership, the great and the good of local Perthshire society, drawn from the nobility, landed gentry, clerics and successful businessmen, especially in Perth. Their twin purposes were discourse. They held regular meetings where members were encouraged to present their researches, their papers then added to the Society's library and archives, and to avidly collect books, manuscripts, coins, natural history, antiquities, and miscellaneous curiosities. Of the very few studies that have been made of the Society, most significant is that by David Allen of St Andrews University. He wrote a brace of papers in 2002, 2003, exploring the sister organisations of the Society and the Perth Library in the context of Enlightenment, culture and politics in the late 18th century. Allen suggests that the Society's key drive was to act as a counterpoint to the professional academic circles of Edinburgh, with an overall ambition of propagating patriotic amateur antiquarians as against a coterie of specialist professionals in the metropolis, so that a solid and trustworthy national culture could flower. The three strands might be summarised as broadening antiquarian study to include natural history, philosophy and the fine arts, and native Scottish literature. Making natural history an antiquarian pursuit was very much a Buchan axiom. His anniversary address to the Society in 1785 took as its subject discourse on the natural history of the world. The Society was to be a provincial, learned body that could freely range across the intellectual landscape in search of inquiries to which amateur researchers might still make worthwhile contributions. Citizen science, we might say today. The Society developed its own inventories of geological specimens and preserved specimens of animals and plants, sometimes including global exotica, so as to furnish their own museum. Less successfully, they began investigating different aspects of the natural world, as well as ordering equipment and technical literature for that research. Members of the Society whose business was printing helped to ensure the availability of key Enlightenment texts on the subject, including Buffon's Natural History and Jean Swammerdam's Natural History of Insects. An extensive natural history collection was poorly served by 19th century and later practices. These 4 specimens are amongst the very few to survive that we can be confident were collected by the Society. Like other collecting pursuits, natural history had a colonial aspect, part of the defining and owning of knowledge as a white hegemony encompassing the natural world and the cultural world. The giant fir tree seen here is one of those planted by the Duke of Atholl from the collecting of Scottish Perthshire botanist David Douglas, an active rival of another Perthshire botanist, Archibald Menzies. Many of the species they brought back to Scotland and Britain were named to them, part of the colonial corralling of foreign ecosystems. I include here 2 of the Coast Salish names for the same tree. Plantings, such as at the Hermitage near Dunkeld, were also part of imagined landscapes that fused such colonial collecting with, in this case, Scotland's romantic antiquarian past, specifically in this instance, around the Ossian poems. Pursuing philosophy and the fine arts affirmed the Society's view of itself as an Edinburgh alternative, whose intelligentsia appeared open to question on both moral and patriotic grounds. Scott, in particular, wanted to ensure that the Society's epistemological orthodoxy was distinguishable from the wild and dangerous doctrines expounded in recent decades by some of the philosophers based in Edinburgh. In his 1802 address to the Society, Scott reminds his amateur colleagues that true and genuine philosophy, of which only we can approve, is that which is opposed to sophistry, or which is contrary to the exercise of false reasoning and to disguised error. When directed in its pursuits and limited in its actings by the reasonable and salutary rules prescribed by religion, philosophy then means the love and study of true wisdom. Perhaps the key founding acquisition for the Society's art collection, apart from Buchan's portrait, of course, was the 1820s donation of 6 paintings given by the Earl of Ormeley, later the Marquis of Breadalbane, on his becoming the MP for Perthshire. The paintings are all of the late 17th century Neapolitan school, its subjects religious and classical, and the artists Caravaggio, Ribera, Beccari, Forelli, Giordano, and Vanvitelli. Space being at a premium, these paintings were kept and displayed at the City Hall, which also hosted occasional exhibitions of the other collections. The Battle of the Amazons by Giacomo Forelli is described with the other paintings in the 1881 history of the Society, where it is noted of this painting that it has always seemed to us that this picture affords valuable materials for study, more especially to those enterprising ladies who boldly leave the accustomed track of their predecessors and seek for the Elysian fields in women's rights, anatomical rooms, scientific societies, et hoc genus omni. This is a supportive seeming statement of female equality from a society that appears to have been resolutely entirely male. In 1835, this 7th painting was added to Ormeley's donation. The Scottish reformers, of course, includes John Knox, an important figure to the history of Perth, where he preached in 1559, and whom the Society described in 1881 as one who stirred up the multitude to that religious revolution which, beneficial in general, yet proved so disastrous to the fine buildings which zealous monks had reared, often with rare architectural skill and classic elegance, for the service of their favourite theology. We'll come back to Knox. As to Scotland's native Gaelic and Scots literature, the Society valued this as against the, at best, ambivalent attitude of Edinburgh's anglicising literati, and undoubtedly a factor in the Society's change of name to the Literary and Antiquarian Society of Perth. The Society's achievements here were somewhat more tangible than with their pursuit of scientific experiments and philosophy, largely due to the active publishing scene in Perth, which saw, for example, the issue of editions of the works of Burns, Ferguson, and Macpherson. A focus on pre-Union literature saw the publication of the metrical history of Sir William Wallace, a select collection of favourable Scottish ballads, and the collection of ancient and modern Gaelic poems and songs. The Society included a coterie of members who collected their Gaelic culture, led by a group of Highland clergymen, notably James MacLagan of Blair Athol parish. Many delivered papers at Society meetings, and these were duly archived. This archive is currently being researched by Donald Stewart, who has observed that it forms a valuable record of late 18th century change as it affected the Gaelic Highlands, with insights on its landscapes, people, their changing culture, occupations, life ways, beliefs, perceptions of the past, and their hopes and fears for the future. A sustained period of success for the Society saw membership rise from the founding 8 to 206 by 1827, all of them white men. The collection also grew quickly, but the limited nature of the accommodation available to the Society, a room in the public library also used as a classroom, meant it was poorly looked after, and many of the donations and manuscripts presented prior to 1819 have been lost, to quote the Society Transactions, published in 1827. By the early 19th century, there was an urgent need for dedicated museum premises. A proposed monument to local worthy Thomas Hay Marshall provided the solution, with Marshall helping to fund the monument so that it could include rooms for the society, of which he was a member, and the library. As soon as 1833, anxieties about the lack of space were voiced and a subcommittee formed to promote the cause of an extension. It stalled several times until the 1860s, when the campaign joined forces with that to create a Perth Albert Institute as a memorial to Prince Albert. A new joint body was proposed with the extension to be built behind the monument. However, it foundered again on lack of money. The Albert project contented itself with a statue on the North Inch, and the museum had to content itself with a redecoration, the installation of a heating system, and a limited redisplay of the collections. The scheme for an extension was renewed in the 1870s. A proposal to convert the City Hall was found unsuitable, and that for new rooms behind the Marshall Monument put forward following the plan shown here. Again, money was wanting. The land around the monument did not become that much desired extension until the 1930s, when a wealthy benefactor left money to the town council for that prescribed purpose, giving the museum its current footprint. In the meantime, the society had basically run out of steam and transferred its museum and collections to the town council in 1914. There are very few photographs of the museum interior, and these are the earliest to survive. They may have been taken in the first decade of the 20th century, probably preserving the layout of the exhibitions as it was when the society reached its end. The displays may well have remained in this form down to the building of the extension and the redisplay that it afforded. Okay, turning to part 3 in Collecting Scotland. Here I will outline 3 case studies: a Bronze Age sword, a late medieval chandelier, and 2 John Knox relics. This late Bronze Age sword is one of the earliest acquisitions of the Society in 1785. It is instructive in both society practices and the value in studying old collections. It appeared to have been lost, as the museum catalogue as at 2000 did not list it, leaving only its acquisition entry. 1785, Roman sword found in the River Forth with a piece of human skull attached to it. Donor, Mr. Coldstream, Crieff. What was in the collection was a sword from Crieff, said to come from a grave, but otherwise poorly provenance. Working with Trevor Cowie at the National Museum in Edinburgh, we were able to untangle a mix-up whereby the sword was initially identified as Roman, when in fact it is Bronze Age, and at some point was divorced from its context and became identified as from Crieff, where the donor came from. Trevor and I published this untangling in the Tayside and Fife Archaeological Journal, Volume 7, situating the understanding of the sword in Bronze Age votive practices. The Society's already noted interest in the Roman past rather cast the indigenous people of ancient Scotland in a role parallel to that of the indigenous peoples of the 18th and 19th century world, with Rome the earlier iteration of the British Empire. It was searching through the Society's papers on the Roman past that I came across an account of a Roman sword found in the River Forth, which sparked the re-evaluation. The sword's donation prompted this account of it by the Reverend Dow of Methven. The weapon presented by Mr. Coldstream was found in the Forth near a place called Cambus, about halfway between Stirling and Alloa. It was accidentally entangled in a fishing net and pulled ashore, with part of a human skull fixed on its point. This warlike instrument, the author of the Itinerarium calls a Roman gladius, on the authority of Montfaucon's Treatise of Roman Arms, where this species of sword is described and also delineated. Mr. Gordon likewise gives drawings of 2 weapons of this sort, one which is found on the Roman wall in the parish of Carridon and is deposited in the Advocate's Library, and the other was discovered somewhere in Ayrshire and belonged to the collection of the late Mr. Woodson, author of the Church History. The last is exactly similar to ours, having the point and handle also broke, but is longer by a few inches. From the gladius in the Advocate's Library, it appears that the handle of this species of weapon was no longer than barely to afford sufficient grasp of the hand, and it seems to have been formed of 2 plates of horn or bone or other proper material fastened, one on either side, by brass pins, some of which still remain in the gladius belonging to the society. But the plates have been consumed by time or destroyed by violence, and also a part of the handle, where it was weakened by a hole made in the middle for receiving one of the fastening pins. That this weapon, which we may call a gladius anceps, belonged to the Romans seems also probable from the one discovered on the Roman wall. We are left entirely to conjecture when we pretend to account for a human skull's being found upon its point. Perhaps in some of the skirmishes between the Romans and the Caledonians on the banks of the Forth, a legionary soldier, having slain his adversary, might, in the wantonness of cruelty and insult, cut off his head and pitch it in triumph on the point of the sword. But while thus indulging the barbarous pride of victory, might meet with some brave Caledonian eager to revenge, perhaps, the cause of his friend, and the haughty Roman, unable to maintain an unequal combat, might rather choose to commit his bloody trophy to the adjacent river than to suffer the mortification of seeing it fall into the hands of the victor. But in points of this kind, everyone is at liberty to frame his own conjecture. In interpreting the sword as a Roman weapon, Dow was working within the main contemporary framework for understanding the past, that provided by literary sources, principally in the form of the Bible and the works of classical authors. Dow's splendidly romantic account of the sword draws upon an imagined encounter between Roman and Caledonian to explain the circumstances of the discovery. The society's Roman fascination has already been remarked upon, and that was also rooted in Renaissance thought, which looked to a classical past, and so it seemed only natural for early antiquarians to turn to Greek and Roman authors to discover the date and origin of the bronze swords that were turned up by the ploughman or the builder. The belief that these swords dated to the Roman occupation of Britain was to linger on into the late 19th century. We jump forward in time now to the late 15th century and medieval Perth to consider this chandelier. It has been in the Perth collection since 1812, when it was purchased by the Society. At the time, it was said to have hung above the altar of the Shoemaker Guild in St. John's Parish Kirk. It still hangs in the kirk, now in front of the altar of remembrance. It has been on loan there since the completion of Lorimer's restoration in the 1920s, other than for a brief loan to the National Museum and a return to Perth Museum in 2010 for the Skin and Bone, Life and Death in Medieval Perth exhibition. This exhibition afforded the opportunity for a much closer look at the chandelier than has been possible for many years, leading to some new observations about a fascinating object, which I'm hoping to see through to publication. Here we can see the entire chandelier comprising 12 branches representing the apostles, surrounding its central figure representing the Virgin and Child as Our Lady of the Sun, Beata in Maria Sole, as described in Revelations. This Marian iconography may suggest it originally lit the Lady Chapel or one of the Marian altars. There are many kinds of bronze, brass, and ceramic lamps used to light medieval churches, but by the 16th century, perhaps the commonest was the multi-branch chandelier of this type. The majority appear to have been made in workshops in the Low Countries and Germany. However, very few have survived, not least because the metal was a valuable commodity, and following the Reformation, many were melted down for reuse. The altars of St. John's Kirk are likely to have been lit by several of these chandeliers, but this is the only one to survive. Or is it? Actually, what this example appears to be is a chandelier made up of the parts of several chandeliers, the parts probably escaping total destruction during the Reformation, possibly by design rather than accident, and then brought back into use, possibly in the 17th or 18th century, the surviving elements put back together to make one chandelier. So in this slide, we see examples of upper and lower branches and the connecting points for them to rest on the the central body of the chandelier, and you'll see different indications of numbering systems on the branches and on the baluster. Frequently, these just don't match up at all. And here's one of the lower tier branches, which again shows the different numbering systems as it's been kind of reused to make more than one chandelier. And here's some other elements of one of the lower tier branches, again with the numbering systems sometimes matching as with the sixes, but in other instances not. One of the sixes here is matched against a 3, so clearly again originally parts of different chandeliers. And here are just a selection of some of the bits of damage which you could see on various of the branches and the candle dishes where they've been repaired or in fact not repaired. The prompter of much, but not all, of the damage done to the fabric and furnishings of St. John's Kirk is historically put down to the somewhat incendiary speech made by John Knox from its pulpit in 1559. The iconoclastic attentions of the mob's reforming zeal would no doubt have included the likes of the chandeliers discussed above. I indicated earlier the Society's interest in Knox because of his physical presence in Perth and the changes wrought by the Reformation. In 1832, 2 different objects were brought to the attention of the Society, which it was very excited to acquire. A 16th century brass candlestick said to have belonged to John Knox and be the very one that deflected an assassin's bullet fired through the window of his Edinburgh house. The second is a walking staff or stick said to have been used by Knox in his old age and passed down through his family. The Society made their initial record in their minute book, as both objects were separately offered to the Society at the same meeting, which caused, as I say, an element of excitement. They were consecutively accessioned as the authentic walking stick of the great reformer John Knox, handed down and attested by a document in the Society's reports of the year 1832, and the candlestick, which belonged to the same celebrated reformer John Knox and was standing before him when he was shot at. See on it the mark of the bullet. The verifying details of the candlestick were repeated in a 1930s relisting and renumbering of the collection. John Knox candlestick, info supplied by donor. This candlestick belonged to the celebrated John Knox and was standing before him when he was shot at and the ball went through the bottom of it. How it came into the possession of my great-grandfather, the Reverend Williamson, who was minister of St. Cuthbert's in King Charles II's time, I do not know. But since then, it has been in the family of the Williamsons till it was left to me by my uncle, J. Williamson, Esquire, when he died, 7th of April, 1826. Signed, Alex Murray. Presented by Alex Murray of Ayton, 1832. The walking stick encouraged the expending of somewhat more ink in recording the circumstances of the donation. The walking cane had been in the possession of the Davidson family, descended from Knox's daughter. On the death of a Mrs. Davidson of Barnhill's Cottage, Perth, the cane passed to a relative in London, Lang, along with the cottage. Seemingly, when the what was to become donor visited the cottage, he accidentally touched the stick. The executor, Mr. Murdoch, remarked, "Mr. Lang, you'll not deprive us of that relic." Lang made inquiry and agreed at once to comply with Mr. Murdoch's request to present it to the Society. 22 years later, the nephew of the now deceased Lang contacted the society to confirm all the details. On the 13th of September 1854, Lang's nephew sent the society an endorsement of the cane written by his uncle before his death. But this endorsement seems not to have survived. The society practiced copying all letters into their letterbook, as well as keeping the original correspondence, but did not copy the endorsement for some reason. When the Perth Handbook appeared in 1848, the relics were by then a staple of the displays and described as one of the highlights to see. How long they remained on display is unclear, but they seem to have faded into obscurity in terms of public attention, perhaps encouraged by curatorial skepticism. Again, I hope to complete a re-evaluation of them in the light of the recent recognition of relics and relic-like objects in connection with other leading figures of the Reformation, notably Luther and Calvin. The handbook, incidentally, also details the cost of a visit. Free if you were a guest of a member, sixpence for a group of up to 8 if you were unaccompanied by a member, with the museum open Monday, Wednesday and Friday, 1 till 3 p.m. And I'd also point on the middle page here to the line underlined in green, which refers to objects acquired through looting after military engagements, which leads us into part 4 of the talk, collecting Southwest Asia and the Pacific. And this comprises 3 case studies of individuals and their collecting on behalf of the society. The Riek brothers, particularly J.P. Riek in Southwest Asia, David Ramsey and Colin Robertson in the Pacific, Ramsey in Oceania, and Robertson on the northwest coast of America. Between the late 16th and the 20th century, the principal burial ground in Perth was Greyfriars, on the site of one of its medieval monasteries. Several of Perth's sons of empire who served in the military and in the East India Company are buried here. On the right in this slide, we see the monument to Colonel Campbell, who served in the Napoleonic Wars and was killed in action at Munchurchur in India in 1844. To the left, we have the tomb of Major General William Farquhar of the East India Company, or the so-called Honourable East India Company. He fulfilled many government roles in India and Malaysia, including founding the settlement of Singapore. In the same cemetery lie the tombstones of the Riek brothers and their families. James, John, and William were all born in the late 18th century and survived into the mid-19th, spending most of their working lives in the military and the East India Company. John and James were both trained as doctors, the former pursuing a medical career through the army and the latter through the HEIC. Their brother William survived the Napoleonic Wars as a major in the Cameron Highlanders. All 3 spent more or less time in Southwest Asia and collected objects which they donated to their city of Perth and its Antiquarian Society in its museum. James was probably the most active, and I will focus on him. Having gained his medical qualification, he was briefly a ship's surgeon and then joined the Bombay Medical Service of the East India Company in 1821. He became a full EIC surgeon in 1831 and shortly afterwards was appointed surgeon to the British mission to Persia or Iran, which is where Persepolis enters our story, long a place of attraction to Western visitors. Between the 17th and the 20th century, large numbers of visitors left their graffiti on the ruins. St. John Simpson's study of the graffiti has shown that most of the foreign graffiti was incised there by British diplomats, military, and East India men, an extension of their colonial ethos. Those who left their graffiti at the Palace of Darius included J.P. Rieck, and you can see it there on the left. In 1836, Rieck was appointed the personal medical advisor to the Shah, mainly based in Tehran. Soon afterwards, the Shah dismissed the British mission, siding instead with Russia, and by 1839, Rieck was back in Britain. He was clearly, though, in Iran at a slightly earlier date, based at the residency in Bushehr, as he cut his graffiti in 1826. That same year, he collected various building fragments from Persepolis and donated them to the Society in Perth. The details are starred on the right in this slide from the Society's minute book, here quoted in the Asiatic Journal and Monthly. This collecting imperative that linked the Society in Perth to the activities of empire in Southwest Asia and the Indian subcontinent is further demonstrated by the preceding entry, accessions of material looted from a temple in Rangoon. The account is graphically Eurocentric, on the one hand appreciating the technical accomplishment and beauty of the ancient writings, but on the other finding the hidden set of clearly sacred statues to be a disappointing stash of idolatrous figures. There seems to be no meeting of minds here. I'll just give you a chance to read that. That Eurocentric colonial mindset is demonstrated explicitly by Rieck himself in a subsequent donation of further Iranian material in 1830. This included an example of a Persian bagpipe, or ney ambana, procured from a maker of such pipes in an Arab pastoral tribe near Bushehr, accompanied by a lengthy account by Rieck, from which I quote these salient comments. Its close resemblance in form as well as in character of the music produced from it to the more improved instrument of the same name in Scotland forms its chief and perhaps its only point of interest. And certainly these constitute the only reasons I have for presuming to suppose that so very rude an instrument could possibly be acceptable. If, however, the latter conjecture is correct, and provided the Society will receive the present as proof of my desire to contribute to its museum, it will be a source of gratification to me when any other opportunity allows of enabling me to add my mite to the antiquarian stores with which my native city is already enriched. Rieck then describes watching the pipe maker, who displayed a very great command of the powers of his rude handiwork. He then explains the pipes are made from antelope skin and that they were used by the Persian or Turkish nomadic tribes of the mountains and the Arab tribes of the coast. The pipes were used to call livestock and to celebrate marriages, feasts, and funerals. It continues that the sounds elicited on first hearing are not dissimilar to those of the Scottish variant, and that such pipes are instruments of great antiquity and geographic spread. He concludes, the difference between the very rude instruments now offered to the Society and the imposing, handsome, warlike bagpipe of Scotland is very striking. But there seems little reason to doubt that the former is the true original of the latter. These two may well represent the present state of the inhabitants of the representative countries of Britain and Persia in which they are now found. The former free, civilized, and enlightened are yet in rapid and accelerating progress towards still incalculable improvements in all that is worthy of men and immortal creatures, while among the latter, the dark ignorance of the earliest ages has not only been perpetuated, but the unceasing oppression of absolute tyrants and the benumbing influence of a false religion appear to have totally eradicated even those cheering symptoms of advancement and civilization which shone on this and the neighboring countries above 1,000 years ago, and still retain the millions of these beautiful regions of the earth in the most debasing and brutifying state of demoralization and disgusting slavery. The voice of the impartial observer. Rieck did not pass everything to the Society and kept hold of some of his Iranian souvenirs. In 1863, 3 years before his death in 1866, he sold this cornelian stamp seal to the British Museum. On at least one occasion, the collecting of the Riots appears to have overlapped. In 1832-3, both James and William were in Egypt. JP was heading back to Scotland on leave and was back in Iran in 1834. The tomb wall fragment and the papyrus roll were collected by James and the funerary cone by William. In addition, William presented a ushabti and James a headrest or a bed. For my second Empire episode, we moved to the Pacific and the collecting habits of another doctor, David Ramsay. Born in Perth in 1794 at 9 North Methven Street, the grey block, in the centre of this slide, he's buried in Australia, but his parents and siblings, including his brother James, who was an interface with the society, are all buried in Greyfriars Cemetery. David was the third son of John Ramsay, a prosperous grain merchant and miller. He was educated in Perth and at Edinburgh University, qualifying as a doctor in 1817. Unable to secure a medical position with the right prospects in London, he became a ship's surgeon. From 1812 to 23, he served on various ships around the Pacific, and his remuneration included a liberty to trade, which he did successfully, clearly giving him a taste for mercantile business. In 1823, he gave up medicine and with Thomas Raine established an import business, Raine and Ramsay, in Sydney. The partnership was dissolved in 1828 and Ramsay developed his farming interests. He was active in public affairs, especially the Presbyterian Church. He took the opportunity to collect both natural history and cultural artifacts, and his interest in the former he probably acquired from his father, a keen collector. David is known to have collected items of natural history in Australia, and he also acquired a number of ethnographic curiosities from the Pacific, which he sent back to Perth. They were presented to the Society on his behalf by his brother James, first in 1825 with a pair of toimoko, repatriated by Perth Museum in 2005, and then a further 50 or so items between 1842 to 44. Some 40 of these survive in the Perth Museum collections, including most of a Tahitian mourner's costume and 2 clubs and 1 spear thrower from Australia, still bearing Ramsay's collecting labels. The collection encompasses Australian Aboriginal artifacts and objects from New Zealand, the Society, Austral and Marquesa Islands, and from Borneo. There's no evidence that Ramsay travelled widely once he had settled in Sydney, and it seems likely that he acquired much of his collection from ship's captains through his business contacts, or possibly even in Sydney auction rooms. All of his donations are of interest because of the early date in the arc of colonial contacts and are in a generally good state of preservation. Some are of considerable rarity, including the Tahitian mourner's costume, a feather headdress from Tubuai in the Austral Islands, and this Maori kakahu kakapo, or feather cloak, the only known example in existence, and which Ramsay described as a singular-looking lady's shawl covered with a sort of greenish feathers and a fringe around it. It's roughly just over a metre square and decorated with kakapo and kaka feathers, red and black wool, and pokinikini, or tassels. The kakapo or night parrot is nocturnal and ground-dwelling, the world's heaviest and only flightless parrot, endemic to New Zealand or Aotearoa. Highly prized by the Maori, they were hunted for food, and the green mottled feathers were used for decorating precious garments. Once found widely, the kakapo is now critically endangered, surviving through a breeding program on predator-free islands. We've supported some of this work with information in Te Papa's Maori Cloaks catalogue and for the kakapo information boards that support the breeding program. We're also hoping to provide DNA samples from some of the feathers. The new museum in Perth will highlight the Maori collection in our care, which will be co-curated with Te Papa, with whom we are developing a memorandum of understanding. My final selection takes us north and east to the Pacific Rim, and the northwest coast of America. We are taken there by another colonial son of Perth, Colin Robertson. Born in 1783, he was raised in Perth, but abandoned his weaving apprenticeship to try and make his fortune in New York. After a brief stint in a grocery store, he joined a fur company, the Northwest Company. Things became, that was in 1803. He left in 1809 and became a merchant in Liverpool, England. In 1814, he returned to Canada, joining the Hudson's Bay Company in a period of intense rivalry with the Northwest Company. Things became hot, and Robertson was forced to flee to the US, then to England, then to France, returning to Canada around 1820. He married a woman from the Métis Nation, and when Hudson's Bay and Northwest Companies united in 1821, he became a chief factor. Ill health caused his retirement in 1840, when he became briefly active in state politics before his death in a sleigh accident in Montreal in 1842. The quieter times of the 1820s gave him the opportunity to collect curios, particularly of the Salish Coast peoples, as much through contacts with others as by his own hands. Again, the time and place meant he put together a group of objects of relatively early colonial contact, several of them rare survivals, including goat horn bracelets, a model canoe with sturgeon fishermen, and a fish-killing club. He seems to have been well disposed towards First Nations peoples, but like his contemporary Riach and no doubt Ramsay, he responded to the technological rather than the artistic and other skills of the indigenous people. In his letter presenting the material to the Perth Society, he chose to point out that the Indians of that part of the world, though far behind in the arts of civilized life, have some claims to notice on the score of ingenuity. This is reflected in the range of objects donated, including raw materials, fire sticks, weapons, needles, and other tools, accompanied by a detailed description of the use of a sturgeon spear and the rituals that preceded that use. Robertson sent the donation in 1832, accompanied by 2 packing lists covering 55 items, a small number of which were lost during the 19th century. The earlier of the 2 packing lists is signed by a James Murray Yale, and they are stated to be curios from the Fraser River area of the Gulf of Georgia. Robertson is not known to have ever been in the Fraser River area, whereas his colleague Yale had. He was stationed at Fort Langley from 1829 to 31 and worked throughout Columbia in the 1820s for the Hudson's Bay Company. And you can see Yale's signature bottom left. One of the key Salish objects which demonstrates not only technical skill, but artistic and cultural creativity is this blanket, a term which rather belies the high status significance of these garments, better described as robes. Like the kakapo cloak and the other Maori items, from the perspective of the indigenous creators, this is a living entity. Chief Janice George of the Squamish has recently said of such objects in a new study on Salish blankets, co-written with Leslie Tepper and Willard Joseph, you should think about blankets as merged objects. They are alive because they exist in the spirit world. They are animal, they are part of the hunter, they are part of the weaver, they are part of the wearer. They identified only 5 blankets known to date with certainty before 1830, including the example currently in Perth, which they also describe as one of the 5 great surviving coloured weavings. Its complexity of pattern, composition, and construction led to their labelling it the transformative pattern blanket. Fundamental to it is the blanket's fringe, longer than on any other complex patterned robe. The use and amount of fringe communicates economic and symbolic information about a garment. Serving no practical purpose in terms of warmth and covering, fringes permit and show off the use of valuable materials as decoration, indicating conspicuous consumption, including the weaver's access to an abundance of raw materials. To quote the authors, symbolically, fringes are said to represent the closeness of the human and supernatural realms. The fluid extension of the threads as the wearers move or dance creates an interface between the person and the empty spaces that surround him or her. They also offer a visual confirmation of the belief that blankets are living objects. As the dancer sways or turns, there is a momentary delay in the subsequent movement of the fringe, almost as if the blanket is an independent being. Among the Haida, for example, a finished blanket is presented at a feast where it is formally presented to the community and given a name. It is then danced for the first time, and through the movement of dance, it is brought to life. So time to sum up. I set out with this presentation to introduce you to the Literary and Antiquarian Society of Perth. Sorry, the fingers just jumped. And the context and range of its collecting practices, as its successor body, Perth Museum Art Gallery, recreates a new museum and seeks to address its colonial inheritance. In summary, the Society was born out of the cultural politics of the Scottish Enlightenment. It was, within gender and status limits, part of a new democratic approach to cultural, especially antiquarian engagement. For the Society, Antiquarian encompassed a broad range of scientific, literary, numismatic, fine art, and historical pursuits, opened up to the interested amateur beyond the confines of university scholarship, notably in Edinburgh. Extensive collecting drove the opening of the Society's Rotunda Museum in 1824. This phase of collecting focused on the history of Scotland and its antiquities, giving at least equal weight to the understanding and collection of Highland Gaelic culture as to the Anglicising lowland culture favoured in Edinburgh circles. Until the museum opened, the accumulation and care of objects was chaotic and disorderly. Through the 19th century, the outlook became more global as the British Empire expanded and Perth's sons partook of its Eurocentric commercial and political opportunities. In the 1880s, it became clear that much desired and campaigned for extension to the museum was not to happen. Within a decade or so of the museum opening, accommodation was cramped and inadequate, and collections care continued to be chaotic. No distinction was drawn around how what was perceived as inferior native material culture was acquired. Trade, gift, and looting were equally valid. In 1914, the Society folded and formally transferred its museum and collections to Perth Town Council. Many of the collecting rhythms continued, but it would be another 20 years before the museum finally won its extension, which gave the museum the physical configuration it has today. Looking to the future, we're seeking to deal with our colonial legacy, our colonial collecting legacy, in several ways. The displays in the new museum will be one avenue by which we can articulate the realities of 19th century collecting, including looting and the Eurocentric worldview that devalued everything else. Is it enough to recognise that such episodes were an acquisition route for objects into the collection? We think not. Building on our more recent history of repatriation and of research accessibility to First Nation communities, we're looking to develop closer relations with the descendant communities of those 19th century encounters from which our world cultures collection is largely drawn. This work is most advanced with the Maori of New Zealand. Working with Te Papa, we have already repatriated 2 Toimoko, and we are now developing a memorandum of understanding that will facilitate our co-curation of the Maori Teonga we hold in the first instance, especially those that will be displayed in the new museum, including the Kakapo cloak. We're actively exploring how we might develop co-curation practices with communities of the northwest coast of America. This will deprivilege the moments of acquisition in the 19th century as determining the entire future of these objects, and bring into the museum other ways of knowing these often living and sacred objects. Few forays have been made into the archives and collections of the Society from an academic viewpoint. It more than merits at least one PhD to understand its full history, or ideally, a postdoc project. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that really fascinating lecture, which raises a wide range of issues for many collections, of course, in this country. So I hope people will be stimulated to send in comments and questions for Mark. And if you do, please do so through the chat. And we've got a question already from Sue Newell, who says, thank you for a truly illuminating presentation. I'm curious about Reverend Scott's relationship with Professor John Walker and his successor, Robert Jameson, at Edinburgh University's Natural History Museum. Does the Society's archive shed any light on this, please? And she comments that she saw that the minerals in the tourist handbook were arranged according to Jameson's system. So does the Society's archive shed any light on that relationship?
Yeah, thanks for the question. My honest answer is I don't know, but it's likely to be the case because they were in contact with lots of other people, even in Edinburgh, which apparently was, you know, contrary to their aspirations. But if he's following the system, he's probably will have been in contact with him, and there may be, I mean, there's quite a lot of correspondence in the Society's archives, and I just haven't read every piece of it, so it's likely that there may be some evidence there. You know, people are welcome to come and research the archives, and probably that's the best way forward with that, is for someone to come and have a look.
So are they indexed in any way, or?
In a very limited way, but we kind of know our way around the collection, so you wouldn't be just cast adrift on it. If someone came to look through it, we'd be able to point you in the right direction, and then it's a case of taking it from there.
And we've got a question here from Stephen King. What's going to happen to the original Marshall Museum building? Stephen's visited Perth Museum and very much enjoyed it. He had to log off briefly, so he's just wondering if you said what's going to happen to the original museum building.
That's going to be retained, and as I say, there wasn't time tonight to talk about the full plan, as it were, but the plan is that the archaeology and history is displayed in the new museum in the centre of town. The art gallery then becomes just an art, well, I say just, it becomes an art gallery where all the art collections are displayed. That's in the current building with the rotunda, and to complete that off, the third aspect of the project is to create a new store for the collections.
Thank you. Jane Glaister's asked, how much of the ethnographic collection was collected by missionaries, and how will you navigate the collecting determinants of missionaries?
I think that we have very few missionary collectors. They do crop up more kind of towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, but they tend to be collecting or sending back one or two items, and not extensive groups of material like Ramsey and Robertson, for example. And obviously, you know, whenever we put any of this stuff on display, if the context is missionary collecting, then we'll deal with that as and when.
Thank you very much. And I wondered whether you're collaborating. I know a lot of museums are thinking about how to display or whether to repatriate their colonial legacy or a part of it. And I just wondered if you're collaborating with other museums in Britain and just in discussion with any of them.
Well, in in Scotland, just before the pandemic struck, actually, the Museums and Galleries Scotland had put together a group to start to think about new kind of national advice for Scotland's museums about repatriation and dealing with colonial legacies, and Perth Museum sits on that panel, and we've also participated in other initiatives like the Pacific Collections Project, which happened 5 or 6 years ago, where a group of museums looked at a whole range of Pacific collections in Scotland's museums. So we do try and be aware of what the situation is here in Britain as well as abroad.
Thank you. And Francis Fowles just written in, can you talk a little more about the pamphlet you showed at the very beginning on subjects for illustration? Was this distributed beyond the members, and how long did it remain in print?
As far as we can tell, it was specifically printed for distribution to the members, and whether it was more widely available, we've got kind of no way of knowing. One can imagine that you know, guests who might be brought along to meetings and things like that might be offered the opportunity to take that away so that they could spread the word perhaps of what the society was doing. And I'm sure in correspondence they would have distributed as well. How many printings it ran to, we don't know, because they don't, the leaflets, the examples we have, and we have several copies within the archive, don't place sort of reprint dates on it or anything. It's just published within a kind of ink blot cover, one of those multicolored ink blot things, like a school exercise book. It almost looks like, except it's printed. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And I wondered about the letter book. It was interesting that you said that the society kept the originals of the letters, but also copied them into the letter book. And I just wondered, presumably it's just because the letters themselves were considered very vulnerable to loss or damage. But I don't know if you know of any other reason why they would do the copying.
I've struggled to come up with any other reason, Suzanne. I mean, it struck me when I first realised what they were doing, that it was a very odd thing to do, to go to the laborious effort of both keeping the letters and then copying them out into the letter book, along with the replies. Well, you can see the value of having a record of your reply, and so maybe they felt that if they're writing replies, they need the original kind of query there as well. But it is quite an odd practice, I still think, and but I think, as you say, the most likely explanation for it is, I mean, the society itself was quite aware of its own shortcomings in keeping things together and not losing things, you know. So maybe they thought, we keep all these letters in one book, it'd be harder to lose this than all these separate letters.
I see. So the letter was followed in the copy, the letters followed by the reply?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that's the case. It's been a while since I looked at the letter book, but I'm sure the replies are in there as well.
It's a great record to have.
Yeah, it is.
And Jane Glaister's asked, if objects are repatriated, do you ask for a guarantee on public access?
Well, I mean, so far in our history, we've repatriated two things: the two Toimoko heads to New Zealand. And for something like that, it's entirely inappropriate to ask for public access, because they're not items that are supposed to go on a public access. So I think that's part of like any case-by-case review you would do of any request for a repatriation. And obviously things which are human remains or otherwise defined as sacred, it just may not be appropriate to ask for a guarantee on public access. So we'd have to play each situation by ear. And I have to say, we're not an institution that's been inundated with requests for repatriation, and we've really been focused on the idea of working with descendant communities and bringing their perspectives into the understanding of things that we steward. I mean, who knows in the future? It's not an issue that's going to go away, and is likely to see increased requests for material. But we are developing a repatriation policy, which will probably be out of date when it's prepared, and then will have to be re-updated. So it's a difficult situation that everybody's in, and we value finding out what the people are doing in these situations as well.
So the next question is changing tack a bit. Beverly Brown is asking, what happened to the so-called Caravaggio and what was its subject?
I knew someone was going to ask me about the Caravaggio, and I meant to look it up. We still have it, and in fact, it gave us a few fraught moments just as lockdown was happening for the first time, because it was on loan in I think it was Vienna, and in Amsterdam it was on loan, and we were really terrified it was going to get caught in a European store somewhere because things ground to a halt. I can't remember the formal title of it, but I think it's St. Thomas showing his wounds. Unless I've totally misremembered that. It's not really, so I'm afraid it's not my area of expertise. But I mean, if people are able to leave emails, I can certainly follow up in detail to any inquiry that people are interested in. But it has been published in several catalogues, I think.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, that's very helpful, because I know that you, Mark, are going to receive the chat. So yeah, if people have queries, they can put their email.
Yeah, so if people leave their emails, I can follow up specific queries like that.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got another question now, reverting to the colonial legacy objects. Caroline Yeo has asked, are there plans to make reproductions of objects prior to repatriation?
Well, as I say, because we're not, as things stand at the moment, we're not looking at caseloads of repatriated objects. You would never make a replica of something like the Toimoko, which we have repatriated. Again, it's totally inappropriate. And were we in that situation, we would probably take advice from who we might be repatriating something to as to whether it was appropriate to do that or not, in terms of what kind of object it was. And it just depends what kind of replica you talk about. I mean, I've been looking at replication recently in the context of our Romans exhibition, because we were doing some 3D replicas, and 3D replicas are touted as this great solution to museum replication. As far as I'm concerned, they're not. They're a total nightmare. They take hours and hours and days to print something out which is actual size, such as a Roman tombstone. And actually, I'm not sure in the context of an experience how useful that kind of replication is. We can give people a sense of what its true weight was, how the thing felt, you know, because you'd think one of the advantages of replication is you can let people handle things where you couldn't let them handle the real thing. But then it's not giving you a true reflection of handling a real thing. So it's a complex issue altogether, I think, replication, but we don't have it defined within our repatriation policy that we would make replicas of things we were giving back. We'd much rather have something donated to us from whichever community it was going to, for example, which would help to cement a relationship now and would build a collection for the future in that way.
It's a really interesting subject, isn't it? Lots of very fascinating aspects to that. So the answer to that question. Thank you very much. And that's the last of the questions in the chat. And actually, we're running out of time. So that was really interesting. The questions and answers that came up. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to join the Wallace Collections History of Collecting mailing list and receive our seminar programme for the year, as well as receiving the abstract in advance of each seminar, please contact us at collection@wallacecollection.org. Seminars in the history of collecting are going to remain on Zoom only for the time being. And our next seminar, as you can see in the slide that Mark has kindly put up now, is going to take place on Zoom at 5:30 on Monday, the 29th of November, when Rachel Peat, Assistant Curator of Non-European Works of Art at the Royal Collection Trust, is going to present her lecture, A Most Distinguished Collector and Patron, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, and Japanese Art, 1869 to 1900. So once again, Mark, many thanks for your really interesting lecture, which raised all sorts of fascinating questions, as well as giving us so much information. I'm just having a look. I can see more things are coming into the chat. Yes, so I hope, yes, you'll be able to see the comments that have just come in. So on behalf of the Wallace Collection, thank you very much for attending this seminar. We hope to see you at future seminars, at other online Wallace Collection events, and in person at the Wallace Collection. If you visit before the 30th of January, you'll have the opportunity to see our special exhibition, Frans Hals, the Male Portrait, which opened in September to critical acclaim. So thank you very much. Thank you again to Mark, and good evening.